There are some mysteries that feel impossible to solve because the answers are buried, hidden, or destroyed. And then there are the truly terrifying ones, the kind where the answer was always right there, in plain sight, quietly waiting for someone to notice. Tonight's story is about one of those cases, a case where police found nothing, witnesses remembered nothing, and time almost erased everything. Almost. Because years later, one ordinary blog post changed everything, not written by a journalist, not written by an investigator, but by someone who seemed to know the story a little too well. And once people started reading between the lines, they realized something horrifying. The person who solved the mystery might not have been an outsider at all. It began in a city that most people would struggle to point out on a map. Quiet streets, small apartment buildings, the kind of place where neighbors recognize each other, S faces, but don't really know each other, S lives. A man named Daniel lived there alone in a third-floor apartment. He worked freelance jobs online, kept odd hours, and didn't talk much to the people around him. To most of the building, he was just another forgettable tenant, the kind of person you might pass in the hallway and never think about again. Then, one winter, Daniel stopped answering emails. His clients assumed he'd taken a break. A few days turned into a week turned into 2. Eventually, the building manager went up to his apartment to check on him after a strange smell started leaking into the hallway. What they found inside would haunt the people who saw it for the rest of their lives. Daniel was dead, but not from anything natural. The apartment showed signs of a struggle. Furniture was knocked over. A lamp was shattered. There was blood on the floor, on the walls, even on the inside of the bathroom door. But there was no sign of forced entry, no broken lock, no smashed window. Whoever had been there, Daniel had let them in. Police investigated for months. They talked to coworkers who had only known him online. They interviewed neighbors who barely remembered him. They checked his phone and his computer. What they found only made the case more confusing. Daniel had been talking to someone, a lot. Long conversations, late at night, stretching for weeks. But the account he was talking to didn't exist anymore. It had been deleted. No name, no profile, no trace. Without a suspect, without witnesses, and without a clear motive, the case slowly went cold. The apartment was cleaned. A new tenant moved in, and Daniel's name became just another unsolved file sitting in a cabinet somewhere. Years passed. Most people forgot the case ever existed. But somewhere out there, someone didn't. A small blog appeared on a free hosting site. No ads, no design, just long posts about strange, overlooked mysteries. The kind of blog that usually gets 10 views and disappears into the internet forever. At first, nobody paid attention to it. The posts were detailed but dry, almost too calm, like they were written by someone who cared more about accuracy than drama. Then one night, a new post went up. It was about Daniel. At first, readers thought it was just another retelling of the case, but as they kept scrolling, something started to feel off. The writer wasn't just repeating what was in old news articles. They were pointing out small details most people had ignored: the position of the furniture, the angle of the broken lamp, the fact that there were no signs of forced entry, but also no signs of robbery. They talked about the online messages Daniel had been sending, not just that they existed, but how they were written, the tone, the pacing, the way the conversations shifted over time. Then the blog post said something that made a few people stop and reread the paragraph. The writer suggested that Daniel had known exactly who was coming to his apartment that night. Not just known them, but trusted them. And more than that, the writer implied that the meeting hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned, carefully. That alone wasn't shocking. Plenty of crimes involve people who know each other. But what unsettled readers was how confident the writer sounded. Not like someone guessing, not like someone theorizing, like someone explaining something they already understood. People in true crime forums started sharing the link, obsessing it, arguing about it. Some said it was just another armchair detective. Others said the post was unusually well researched. But then someone noticed something small, buried deep in the text. A reference to a detail that had never been made public. A detail about something found in Daniel S. kitchen that only investigators and the building manager should have known. That's when the mood changed. Suddenly, this wasn't just an interesting blog post anymore. It was a problem. More people began to comb through the article line by line. They compared it with old reports, with archived news stories, with court documents, and every time they did, they found the same thing. Most of the information matched what was publicly known, but a few pieces didn't. A few pieces were too specific, too accurate, too private. The comments section filled up fast. People asked the writer where this information came from, if they had a source, if they were connected to the case. For a while, there was no response. Then, almost a day later, the writer replied with a short message saying they had only used careful reasoning and publicly available clues. They told people not to read too much into it, but that explanation didn't sit right with anyone who had been following closely. A group of online users decided to dig into the blog itself. They checked the account history, the older posts, the way the writer talked about other cases, and that's when they noticed a pattern. The blog wasn't just focused on random mysteries. It kept returning to one specific type of story, cases where someone vanished or was killed. And the only real connection was online contact. It was as if the writer had a personal interest in that exact scenario. Then one of the users did something simple but incredibly important. They copied a paragraph from the blog and pasted it into a search engine, not to find the same text somewhere else, but to look for similar writing styles. A few obscure forum posts popped up, old ones, years old, written by an account that no longer existed. The style was eerily similar. Same rhythm, same strange choice of words, same habit of explaining things in a very careful, almost rehearsed way. They dug deeper. That old forum account had been active in a community Daniel used to visit. It had commented on the same threads, replied to the same people, and more than once, it had replied directly to Daniel. At the time, it meant nothing, just two strangers on the internet crossing paths. But now, with the blog post in mind, it started to feel like more than a coincidence. When they lined up the timelines, things got even worse. The forum account stopped posting around the same time the blog started, almost like one identity had been replaced by another. And in the weeks before Daniel's death, that forum account had been active at the same hours Daniel was. Late nights, early mornings, over and over again. It started to look less like random overlap and more like two people talking privately, somewhere no one else could see. Still, none of this was proof. It was all patterns and suspicion. The kind of thing the internet is very good at building and sometimes very wrong about. But then something happened that made even the skeptics uneasy. The blog post was edited. Not in a big way, just a few sentences changed, a few words removed. But someone had saved the original version, and when they compared the two, they noticed that the removed lines were the ones that sounded the most personal. The ones that described Daniel S.'s final night in a way that felt less like analysis and more like memory. People started taking screenshots of everything, the blog, the comments, the edits, because now it felt like the writer was trying to quietly erase something. And then one morning, the entire blog was gone. The page didn't load. The account didn't exist. Every link led to an error. It was as if it had never been there at all. But by then, it was too late. Copies of the post were already everywhere, saved, shared, archived. And now, instead of being read as just another theory, people were reading it with a very different mindset. They started asking a much darker question. What if this wasn't someone trying to solve the mystery? What if this was someone trying to control the story? The more they reread it, the more uncomfortable it became. The way the writer described Daniel's movements, the way they explained what he was probably thinking, the way they seemed so certain about what he did and didn't expect that night. It didn't sound like guesswork anymore. It sounded like someone who had been there, or someone who had planned to be. A few people tried to send what they had found to the police, but without a real name, without an IP address, without anything concrete, there wasn't much that could be done immediately. Officially, the case was still unsolved. Unofficially, a lot of people were starting to believe that the person who knew the truth had already spoken, just not in a way that could get them arrested. And that's where this part of the story stops. With a vanished blog, a dead man, and a growing suspicion that the internet hadn't just helped uncover a mystery, it had been used by someone who was trying to stay one step ahead of it. Because what people didn't know yet was that the blog was the only place this person had left their words behind. And when someone finally connected those dots, the story would take a turn that nobody was ready for. By the time people realized the blog was gone, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Screenshots were being passed around quietly at first, then more openly. Entire copies of the post were archived on obscure websites. But the strangest part wasn't just that someone had written about Daniel with such unsettling precision. It was how the post seemed to anticipate questions before anyone even asked them, as if the writer had already imagined how people would try to pick it apart. A small group of online users, the same ones who had traced the writing style back to that old forum account, decided to keep digging. They weren't professionals, no badges, no warrants, just people who had spent too many nights reading about cold cases and unsolved crimes. And sometimes that kind of obsession is exactly what makes someone notice the details everyone else misses. They went back to Daniel's online history, not just his public posts, but the platforms he used, the times he logged in, the kind of conversations he had. One pattern stood out. In the months before his death, Daniel's activity had changed. He posted less in public spaces, but his private messages, at least the ones that could still be partially recovered from backups and old notifications, had increased. Someone had slowly pulled him away from the open internet and into one-on-one conversations. And then there was the timing. Whoever he was talking to seemed to be online at the same hours. Late at night, early in the morning, long stretches where both accounts were active, then both went quiet at the same time. It was the digital equivalent of two people sitting in the same room, talking, until one of them finally fell asleep. The problem was, most of those messages were gone, deleted, wiped. The only reason anyone knew they had existed at all was because of fragments left behind in old email notifications and server logs that had not been fully erased. Just enough to prove there had been someone else. Not enough to prove who. But then one of the group noticed something else, a username. It appeared only once in a cached page from an old discussion thread Daniel had been part of. A reply that no longer existed but had been partially preserved by an archive site. The name didn't mean anything on its own. It wasn't obviously threatening. It wasn't obviously fake. It was just there. They tried searching for it. At first, nothing came up. No active accounts. No profiles, no social media. It looked like a dead end. But one of them decided to try something different. They searched the username together with phrases that had appeared in the blog post. Unusual turns of phrase, odd word choices, things most people wouldn't normally type. And then, finally, something appeared. A forgotten comment on a tiny, almost abandoned blog from years ago. The style was unmistakable, calm, careful, slightly detached, the same way of explaining things, the same way of building a point slowly, like the writer wanted to guide the reader's thoughts instead of forcing them. That comment led to another and another, scattered across different sites, different years, different topics, but always the same voice. Whoever this person was, they didn't talk much. But when they did, they left a very specific kind of footprint. Slowly, a picture began to form. This wasn't someone who suddenly became interested in mysteries. This was someone who had been watching people online for a long time, commenting occasionally, engaging just enough to build familiarity, then moving on. And then there was Daniel. When they lined everything up, it became disturbingly clear that Daniel hadn't just randomly met someone dangerous. He had been noticed, studied, chosen. The group shared what they found with each other, but they hesitated to go public with it. Accusations without proof can destroy innocent lives. And even though this all felt wrong, even though it felt like they were circling something very dark, they still didn't have the one thing that mattered, a real identity. That changed when someone made a mistake. A new account appeared on one of the forums where the case was being discussed. It didn't post much, just a few comments here and there, correcting small details, pointing out minor errors in people's timelines. The kind of behavior that looks helpful on the surface, but slowly starts to feel controlling. One user noticed the writing style immediately. It wasn't identical to the blog, but it was close, very close. The same calm tone, the same habit of breaking things down step by step, the same way of steering conversations without sounding like they were doing it. They decided to test something. They brought up a detail from Daniel's case that wasn't in any public record. Something only people who had read the original blog post carefully would even think to mention. Within minutes, the new account replied. And in doing so, they accidentally revealed they knew exactly what that detail was referring to. The reply was deleted almost immediately, but not fast enough. Screenshots spread, and suddenly the mood shifted again. This wasn't just about an old blog post anymore. This was happening in real time. People began watching the account's activity, not publicly, not loudly, quietly. They noted when it logged in, when it logged out, what threads it read, what it avoided, and then someone noticed something that made their stomach drop. The account was active from the same city Daniel had lived in. That alone didn't prove anything. Cities are big. Millions of people share the same internet infrastructure. But combined with everything else, it was enough to make one thing clear. This wasn't just a story about the past. This was about someone who might still be out there, reading everything, adjusting their behavior, trying not to be seen. A few members of the group decided to send everything they had to law enforcement. The archived blog posts, the writing comparisons, the screenshots, the timelines. This time, it wasn't just a vague tip. It was a package of information that showed a consistent pattern of behavior stretching back years. Whether the police took it seriously or not was something the group never fully found out. Investigations don't move in public, and if something was happening behind the scenes, no one was going to announce it on a forum. What they did notice, though, was that the suspicious account stopped posting completely. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No new comments, no new corrections, no quiet steering of conversations. It was as if whoever had been behind the screen had finally realized they were being watched. For a while, that felt like a victory. But there was still one question no one could answer: if this person really was connected to Daniel's death. If they really had used the internet to get close to him, to plan everything, and then to quietly rewrite the story afterward. How many times had they done this before? Because the blog hadn't just talked about Daniel, it had talked about other cases, other disappearances, other deaths. Always with the same calm, analytical tone, always with the same unsettling level of detail. And that's the part that still keeps some people awake at night. The idea that somewhere out there, someone might not just be committing terrible acts, but documenting them, studying the reactions, learning what details attract attention and which ones get ignored, learning how close they can get to the truth without crossing a line that gets them caught. The scariest part isn't that a mystery was solved by a blog post. The scariest part is that the blog post may have been written by the very person who caused the mystery in the first place. Officially, Daniel's case remains unsolved. No arrests were announced. No names were released. No courtroom ever heard the full story. All that exists are fragments, archived pages, screenshots, writing patterns, and a trail of digital breadcrumbs that point to something deeply wrong, but never quite reach a door that can be kicked in. Maybe the person responsible is gone. Maybe they're still out there, watching from a different account, on a different platform, under a different name. Maybe they learned from this and became more careful. Or maybe they're reading stories like this one right now, wondering how close people really came. Because if there's one thing this case proves, it's that the internet doesn't just remember things. Sometimes it remembers people, and sometimes, if you look closely enough, it remembers them better than they remember themselves. And that's a terrifying thought to end on. Not because every mystery has a monster behind it, but because sometimes the monster doesn't hide in the dark. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, typing calmly, waiting for the next story to begin.